Welcome to Masters of Regeneration Radio. Conversations with humans who dare to reimagine our place on planet Earth. Earth is changing fast. Evolution happening in real time. An intimate, circular understanding of nature and living systems. We are the land. The land is us.
Hey everyone, welcome to Masters of Regeneration Radio. This is episode 27 and this is your host, Tomas Reyes. Remember when I speak of a transition from belief systems to living systems? That mind-blowing experience filled with awe, the dance between the external world we shape with our thoughts, our words, and our actions, and how we have identified with the world we created as a species outside ourselves. And how, by returning to our inner world, as we reconnect to nature, we start listening and understanding the messages that the world of nature has for all of us. We start organizing the world, healing what is broken, harmonizing, synchronizing with the natural world. Do you remember? If not, check out episode 22 of Masters of Regeneration Radio. It's called This Is Our Time. There is always a time to ask questions, excellent questions that open up our attention to the potential everywhere. This is one of those times. What needs to happen so that we can ask ourselves excellent questions en masse? What needs to happen so that we understand that we build reality, that we can do so in harmony with nature? Our guest today is Daniel Wahl, author of Designing Regenerative Cultures. Daniel explores ways in which we can reframe and understand the crises that we currently face and explores how we can live our way into the future. Did you hear that? How we can live our way into the future. Moving from patterns of thinking and believing to our practice of education, design, and community living, he systematically shows how we can stop chasing the mirage of certainty and control in a complex and unpredictable world. This book explores how we might live our way rather than know our way into the future, how we might stop chasing the mirage of certainty and control in this complex and unpredictable world. How can we collaborate in the creation of diverse regenerative cultures adapted to the unique biocultural conditions of place? I'm going to say that again. How can we collaborate in the creation of diverse regenerative cultures adapted to the unique biocultural conditions of place? How can we create conditions conducive to life? Isn't that a great question? Anyway. Daniel Wahl works internationally as a consultant and educator in regenerative development, whole systems design, and transformative innovation. He holds degrees in biology from the University of Edinburgh and holistic science from the Schumacher College. And his 2006 doctoral thesis was on design for human and planetary health. His book, Designing Regenerative Cultures, was published in 2016 by Triarchy Press and quickly reached international acclaim. It was released in Portuguese in 2019 and a Spanish edition will be launched in 2020. This is episode 27 of Masters of Regeneration Radio, and this is your host, Tomas Reyes. Remember, we are on all those good podcast platforms, on Stitcher, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, Google Podcasts, you name it, all of those. If you're enjoying, please give us 5 stars on iTunes and share the podcast on social media. We're so grateful for all your feedback and so grateful we get to share this important knowledge and these great conversations with these wonderful people. Here we go. Daniel Christian Wahl.
Yeah, no, there's a lot going on, definitely. Everywhere. There's, as kind of negative as the news are, there's also a hell of a lot going on in every country in terms of mobilization of a different way of being.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's a big, big global transition. What's been your trajectory? What led you? What sort of like life transition did you experience? Or were you always interested in sustainability and then regeneration? Or how'd that happen?
Well, I guess initially, around about my teenage years, I started to be kind of more of an activist and socially engaged and environmentally engaged. I remember when I was 14, 15, giving talks about Greenpeace in my school, just going from classroom to classroom, and the same with Amnesty International. And then at the time, I kind of got into sort of teenage rebellion and was a bit of a punk and went to a few demonstrations. And at that time, it was against basically nuclear weapons in the Cold War and nuclear power plants in Germany. And then I sort of got sidetracked by just falling in love with learning more about life, about nature, and got onto this track of becoming a marine biologist. And that's really my first degree. And I remember there was a moment when I was coming back from having spent time out with following dolphins in Monterey Bay. And I asked myself the question, what's the point in spending the rest of my life studying these animals if most likely the other things that are happening on the planet are getting worse and worse, and eventually these species will go extinct? And I, at that point, kind of decided that science in this narrow way of just doing quantitative analysis of statistically significant behavioral patterns that was only telling the tip of the iceberg of what I was experiencing more from a sort of embodied naturalist kind of connection with these animals. Wasn't for me. And so with a couple of detours, I ended up initially wanting to start an eco-village and environmental education center in southern Spain in the late 90s, and really falling flat on my face with that project by just not knowing enough, and particularly thinking that it was all about the technological things about solar panels and straw bale buildings and compost toilets and how to do permaculture well, and then realizing that the economic and the social dimension of all that is really where a lot of the foundations get laid for successful projects and successful communities. And so that's what took me to Schumacher College in the early 2000s. Did a master's in holistic science there, and then really, like, by studying Gaia theory, by studying deep ecology and complexity theory and Earth system science, and also Goethe's way of looking at science much more in a sort of phenomenological way, or in a way that Maturana and Varela would, where the dimension of mind and how we look at the world becomes conscious. So you pay attention to the fact that just the stories we tell about what reality is actually mattering the world that we live in. And so theory matters, that there's this bullshit dualism between, he's a practitioner, he is a theoretician, is a dualism, because if we change story, if we change organizing ideas and worldviews and visions, then we really change things upstream in the design process, and everything downstream changes. And so I got really excited about that, ended up doing a PhD in design, and then realizing that academia was just in 2006 not ready for that radical transdisciplinary approach. Having come from biology over holistic science to a PhD in the art and design school, they didn't know how to fund me. I was sent from one funding council to the other, because the designers and artists would say, that sounds too scientific. The science research council would say, you are science school, and
the story of my life. Yes.
So that's when I sidestepped and ended up connecting with Gaia Education. Did the very first eco-village design education course that they offered in 2006, I believe it was, in Findhorn, and at the Findhorn Eco Village. And really connecting to old friends that I'd met there before when I first went to Findhorn in 2000. And long story short, I ended up taking over Findhorn College, which is the educational charity within the foundation that works with universities. And so I spent 4 years bringing academic students and professors to the eco-village to really engage them with lived sustainability, with a community that had an alternative currency, that had a community-supported agriculture system, that had 80 different ecological buildings of high performance, that had a community-owned wind farm, electric cars, and all those kind of things. And that was wonderful. That was a deep opportunity to learn by doing, and I learned so much there simply by absorption, by cultural osmosis, and also had the opportunity to link in with pioneers, bring pioneers to Europe, link in with the California Institute of Integral Studies, and basically weave these organizations. That's something I'm really passionate about, to weave the larger collaborations across the planet of organizations that have already been doing in their own way regenerative work for a long time. So yeah, that's a long way of saying it's been a long journey, and everything is built on it. And through that journey, also spent some time at the Center for Alternative Technology in Wales, which has also been very influential on me, because they're kind of looking at the nuts and bolts technology of relocalization and using renewable energy and green building methods. And
Wonderful.
Between all those organizations, Schumacher, CAT, and Findhorn, I feel like I got a really rounded, holistic understanding of the shift that we now have to embark on. And since then, yeah.
Was the culmination of all these experiences your book that came out in 2016, was it? The Designing Regenerative Cultures?
Yeah, in a way, the book is a sort of... in between 2004 and 2006, I wrote this massive PhD thesis, which was called Design for Human and Planetary Health, with the sort of academic subtitle, A Holistic Integral Approach to Complexity and Sustainability. And it was massive. David Orr recommended it to MIT Press for publication. And then in the end, they didn't want to publish it because it was too big, and I didn't want to rewrite it. And in 2006, David said to me, Daniel, you need to write the book that only you can write. And we had a conversation that sort of triggered, through one particular part of that conversation, triggered the idea of this book. But then I spent 10 years working with lots of different organizations, with Findhorn, with the Global Eco-Village Network, with UNITA, with UK Foresight in Futures Consultancy, became a member of the International Futures Forum. And all those experiences gave me a sort of much more practical and applied understanding of the theory that I developed in my PhD. And in many ways, the book is 10 years after the PhD, sitting down and saying, okay, what's still relevant and what can I put in here that actually has meaning in 10, 20 or 30 years time? That's why the book is very focused on questions, because I think answers only have a short shelf life in a transforming world. But questions have a power of bringing people together and keeping us innovating and inventing and co-creating that is much more apt as a guiding compass towards the future.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
I really love this sentence that I saw on a summary about your book that says that this book explores how we might live our way rather than know our way into the future, right? How we might stop chasing the mirage of certainty and control in a complex and unpredictable world, and how we're in this transition where we feel it's enough of this trying to control nature and trying to have this illusion of certainty in our lives, and rather partner with nature. So what are the questions you're asking yourself and sort of encouraging people to ask themselves? What are some of those questions?
Well, let me just briefly come back to this kind of, I think this is so important, this bit of embracing uncertainty. Like what the course that I mentioned, Masters in Holistic Science at Schumacher College, I had this opportunity to spend a year, or actually 18 months, with a man called Professor Brian Goodwin, who was one of the co-founders of the Santa Fe Institute for Complexity Studies, and one of the 20th century's leading theoretical biologists and mathematicians. And a lot is being said about complexity and about emergence. Emergence is a real buzzword in so many circles now. But one thing that very often we still try to do is we try to wrestle with the world as if we need to predict and control it. And the fundamental lesson of complex dynamic systems, and which go back really into early chaos theory, Henri Poincaré, when he talked about the three-body problem, like an asteroid orbiting around the moon of a planet. You have three interacting variables, and then you have a system that basically runs on nonlinear mathematics, and you can't predict and control it beyond a very limited time frame. And that lesson then applied to the fact that almost everything we can think of, every cell in your body, every organ, you yourself, your family, your community, the ecosystem or the city you live in, they're all complex dynamic or complex adaptive systems nested into each other. They're not separate. They're all part of one big process transforming. And once you understand that we have to just let go of certainty, and we have to let go of thinking that we know, we have to accept that there's a limit to our knowing, then the shift from prediction and control to appropriate participation. How do I participate in this unpredictable whole that is constantly transforming in ways that, as Janine Benyus would put it, creates conditions conducive to life, that makes the system as a whole healthy, and therefore, since I'm part of it and I'm an expression of it and a co-creative agent in it, I will be better. And that's a fundamental shift. That's when everything changes, when we realize that as another mentor of mine, Elizabeth Sotoris, says, as ecological and biological systems mature, they realize that there comes a point where it's cheaper to feed your enemy than to kill them. Mm-hmm. We now live on a planet that is so full, and we're so connected to everything that goes on the planet, that the only way to care for ourselves is to care for the whole community of life, not just the whole of humanity. We have to care for the biosphere, our ecosystems, and everybody on this planet. Everything else will be short-lived. And so for me, that's at the essence, becoming a regenerative culture in place, adapted to the uniqueness of that place and the history and culture of that place, becoming an expression of the uniqueness and essence of that place and its potential to be contributing health and wholeness and well-being and value to the nested system it sits in. So from place to region to nation to planet. Mm-hmm. That's the game we're in. And all the questions that I in my book are questions that somehow find an entry point into this conversation and engage people to say, is this meaningful to you in this place, and how could you do it?
Wonderful. Yeah, I think that that's what I see the major transition and the major challenge, and it seems so dramatic right now because we're changing our perception and our understanding of our participation in reality, really in the creation of and the sustenance or the stewardship of life. Right? It's a completely different paradigm as a consumer, as a producer, as a thinker, as a business person to want to extract because the most important thing is to have more power, more money, and buy more stuff and keep on extracting, as opposed to a circular, regenerative understanding of your participation in this. And so I ask myself a lot that question, like how do we communicate this to, say, I'm in Bogota right now, there's 9 million people. Mm-hmm. It's a big city and it's very busy. It's wonderful. It has this great energy. And it seems like more and more people around the world want to, at the same time, they understand that we're in a climate crisis and we have to do something about it. At the same time, we're kind of like wanting to experience more of this, that these wonderful cities have to offer, all this variety and all this diversity. So yeah, like how we bring this, and when you were talking about communities, I'm really interested in that, because like I'm a chef and a producer, so I'm interested in food and feeding people and sort of like sharing all this knowledge through food, which ultimately will change your mind, right? It's just the minute you start connecting with nature through food, your digestive system will end up influencing your thoughts in a way.
I mean, this for me, food is a wonderful entry point, because, like, if that, I think the core understanding of this shift in perspective, which in many ways, even the framing of a paradigm shift, which is very popular, has a sort of trap in it, in the sense that in history, very often we moved from one paradigm to another. And the pattern by which we did that is that we stuck with the old paradigm and we're hanging on to it for so long that all the negative side effects of it kind of got so pertinent that we then overswing the pendulum and go to the other extreme. We dismiss almost everything of the old paradigm. And so I think it's part of an old paradigm to keep swinging in that way, to over go from one extreme to the other. And I think that new, like, there's a wonderful article by Donella Meadows about leverage points to intervene in the system. And there's a first edition of it where the highest level of intervention is the level of the paradigm. And then with her own learning, and then 10 years later or something, she realized that there was another level. And so she wrote another version of that article in which the highest level of intervention is to go beyond paradigms, to basically become conscious of when we use what paradigm and know that each one of them has a certain value and a certain power of meeting the world. But the minute you take a perspective, you create a blind spot. And so by being able to operate between paradigms and shift them, you get a better perspective of this unpredictable and uncontrollable reality we participate in, because you get a couple of more angles on it. And that minute, in the minute we shift to that, a lot of what we currently have clashes about, violent differences of opinion, would be not so strong anymore, because we would basically not like value multiple perspectives and value multiple ways of knowing more, and through that stop polarizing and othering people quite so much. But let me come back to the food bit, because one of the key aspects is understanding our interbeing with all there is, and the human microbiome idea, the fact that we as human beings are actually more non-human cells than we are human cells, and that we're really a walking ecosystem, and that everything we eat influences that ecosystem inside us, that switches on and switches off the different genes, creates all sorts of enzyme cascades, basically fundamentally shifts how we are in terms of our health, and that shifts how we perceive the world. Like, I mean, you know the difference between perceiving the world on a day where you have a cold and you're sniffly and you don't, it doesn't come in the same way as a day where you've just gone for a run and stood under a waterfall and feel completely energized. Suddenly the world just shows up differently.
Yeah.
And food does that for us all the time. Most people, like the fact that, who was it? Was it Wendell Berry? Yeah, Wendell Berry said that it's bizarre that we have a medical system that doesn't think about food, and a food system that doesn't think about health. Like, because the two of them are like the basis of good health, the basis of that scale-linked health and wholeness that we want to regenerate starts with what we eat and how we eat and how we grow the food. And so, yeah. That's a
absolutely
great entry.
Yeah. And I did a whole episode of the podcast by myself a few months ago, because I had a lot of things to say about that, about our experience in the city, right? Like, you're experiencing, so the measures of the quality of the air, the water, and the food in a city are pretty, are pretty scary. The levels of the health of those three, and the more you become aware as a consumer of what it is that the city is offering you, and you realize that there's all these things, all these vegetables and all these sausages and all these meats and all that kind of look like the real thing, but they're not, right? Mm-hmm. They're like empty shells that have been kind of stripped. All the genetic memory, all the information that is crucial for evolution, for our bodies to thrive, has kind of been taken away because the focus of the production of these food items has been to just make a lot of money for the shareholders who own this food production company, for example. And so that's why I try to teach my students in my workshops is like understand that food is not just energy. It's going to make you who you are and how you think, and it's going to bring a lot of essential information and memory to your children if you have some, right? So
one medical system that knew that for thousands of years is the Vedanta, like the Indian Ayurvedic tradition that always understood the link. I mean, that whole concept of prana, I find it so palpable, like the difference between going to the supermarket here and buying some kind of flown in piece of lettuce that has been gassed to last longer, yeah. and going to the local organic farmers market and buying a lettuce that still had connection to Mallorcan ground in the morning when the dew was on it and has just been cut, is still alive, is still talking. It's like you can see it in the hydraulic tension in the leaf, how much it's still bursting with energy. Yeah. When you eat that, it's not the same food. Yeah. It might both be called lettuce, but it's not the same food.
It's not the same. Things are not what they seem to be, where they appear necessarily.
But briefly on the city thing, mm-hmm. I think that one of the changes that we're invited into in this kind of, like, I write a lot about this whole kind of change of narrative from the story of separation to the story of interbeing. It's a constant practice to ask, how do I experience interbeing? And so in a big city, the way that the media would focus us on the city is like, we have a traffic problem, we have a pollution problem, we have a waste problem, we have a crime problem, we have a drugs problem. And it shows you episodes of behavior that is degenerative or has hurting to the health of the whole system. And so you think that the whole place is in competition with each other. But if you re-perceive your interbeing when you're in a city, I find cities the most amazing examples that the vast majority of all human interactions are collaborative, and only very few are competitive. The fact that the traffic actually somehow works, as crazy as it might be in Bogota, but it somehow works. Yeah? And that people can cross the streets without somebody saying, I'm going to speed up and see if I can hit them. Like, normally people don't do that. Most of the time. Yeah? And so my friend Marilyn Hamilton, who writes about the integral city, she like points out that really a city is a living being. It's like a massive cell. It's another level of, like, evolution proceeds by divergence and then convergence of that diversity at a higher level of complexity into a new pattern. And in many ways, a city is that another larger being of all the beings that are living in it. And
it has a few rules, but it's chaotic. Right?
Yeah.
Sorry, I interrupted you.
No. But it's that idea that basically with very few enabling constraints, which I think is a much more powerful term than rules, because rules make us rebel to them. But enabling constraints can actually lead to positive emergence in a complex system, and positive emergence will be and people caring for their city and their neighborhood and cleaning it up. And it's happening all over the planet. People taking back the streets, replanting trees, understanding heat island effects, and knowing that the more greenery we've got in the city, the less air conditioning and energy we need to use, the more the water will get cleaned by itself, the air will be cleaner. There's a lot to be done in transforming cities, and one of the wise elders, and for me one of the early visionaries of regenerative regional development, is a guy called Sir Patrick Geddes, who was a biologist in Scotland at the end of the 19th century, and ended up as a biologist also being credited for founding the discipline of sociology and the discipline of town planning. He was one of these true, in those days, they were still polymaths. They weren't just generalists. They actually knew lots of disciplines rather than a little bit of lots of disciplines.
Yeah.
And he, in 1910, wrote a book called Cities and Evolution, in which he explained that any healthy city has to think of itself in the connection with its bioregion, with how the rivers from the mountains to the sea flow, and how the city needs to meet most of its fundamental needs within that bioregion, but not in a kind of extractive way, but in a regenerative way, by feeding back what's into that system so it can regenerate the things that you then sustainably harvest off it, to meet the needs of the population, not just the human, but also the more than human population of city and bioregion. And I think that's where we're coming back to. We're realizing that we've created a globalized system that had all sorts of benefits, but a lot of very bad side effects. And if we want to refit the human presence on Earth, the appropriate scale is at the community and at the bioregional scale. And I think that's happening everywhere. And I know that there's an initiative in Colombia and Bogota as well to look into that.
Oh, there's many. There's actually, I was going to say, I have some friends here who work in partnership with the Schumacher College. They're called Efecto Mariposa. But there's also hundreds of indigenous organizations and people kind of experiencing this empowerment at the micro level, right? There's a small community outside of Bogota, and it's all about regenerative architecture and building design, right? And so on and so forth. People are activated, they're engaged, and they're empowered. And I love to see this transition from this idea that the government or big corporations will provide, and citizens going, well, what if we take back that power and we just split, atomize into these micro communities, and we all inspire one another to create more life, basically, and to protect those conditions that give us life, right?
I think it needs to happen on all scales. It needs to have these small neighborhood face-to-face, or even at the personal and family level. Like, one of the core principles of regenerative practice is that it starts within. It starts with personal development, and then it starts with building the capacity of the people around you to support each other in learning how to be better regenerators. And in the process of doing so, you're already regenerating. And then you start with looking at what projects to co-create and how they serve both your place and the next place out from there. And I think we see that at so many scales. Like I just recently, in end of August, I was on a call with a number of people who live in Colombia. And one of the people was the son of I think the business chain is called Crepes and Waffles. And I don't know much about it, but the way he explained what they're doing is also an example of how, from an entrepreneur's entry point, you can begin to re-empower women, to give women more agency in their community, to look at your supply chain and work with the providers in such a way that they get paid a fair price and incentivized to grow regeneratively, to use agroforestry and regenerative agriculture. And I think it needs all of that. I'm not so keen on the large multinational corporations. I think they need to reinvent themselves quite significantly, but larger businesses in a region can have a very powerful influence in helping us catalyze this transition, because they have the initial resources to get stuff started.
Absolutely. Yeah, Krebs is a good example. I know them, and they work with many of the friends who are working in regeneration and holistic science here in Colombia, and they hire single moms, and they also promote a lot of clean agriculture and small producers and all that. It's wonderful. I was curious about your Sustainable Development Goal flashcards. When did you do that, and how did that? I'm just really interested in the materialization of all these ideas into sort of like manuals or guidebooks, and especially for kids and younger crowds, right?
Yeah, it's a project that I really enjoyed doing. Basically, round about the time that I finished the draft of my book and sent it to the publisher, one thing that a lot of people don't know, that very often when you've written a book and you finish the manuscript and you think soon it will be out, it roughly takes about a year from submitting the manuscript to a publisher to the book actually being out. And in that year, I reconnected more deeply with an organization that I already mentioned that I've been involved with since 2007, called Gaia Education. And I've written curriculum for them off and on, and the first job I did was revise their online course, which is called Design for Sustainability, which is a 400-hour online course that takes you through the ecological, the social, the economic, and the worldview dimension of creating sustainable systems, whether it's at the community or the bioregional scale. And in many ways, it's a kind of 101 for regeneration. It just gives you it maps out so many cool initiatives, from dragon dreaming to nonviolent communication to sociocracy to local currencies to you name it, to ecological sewage treatment and green building and blah, blah, blah.
Wow, wonderful.
It kind of just puts a lot of things on people's map that even if they know half of it, they'll be surprised by the other half. And even if they know a lot and they know 2/3 of it, they'll still find something that they're surprised at. And so when the SDGs were ratified in September 2015, we immediately talked in the kind of steering team for Gaia Education that since we've had this long-term relationship with UNESCO and for 10 years we're part of the UN Decade for Education for Sustainable Development, and then we're also part of the UN GAP plan, the implementation plan for Agenda 2030, that we should create some form of engaging with the SDGs. And when I was asked to create a workshop, one thing that we'd realized that a lot of our workshops were a little bit long, like the face-to-face workshops of a week or a month, not so many people can engage with. And so we challenged ourselves to create a one-day workshop. And as already mentioned at the time, and still, I'm very keen on questions rather than answers. And so long story short, I asked myself a couple of questions. I decided, okay, could we create a analog viral spread? So could we create a workshop that was so simple to facilitate and had such cool teaching tools and methods that anybody who'd experienced the workshop and was given a manual on how to hold the workshop, what they've just experienced step by step, this is what you say then, and this is how you set it up and all that, would feel empowered to possibly become a multiplier of the workshop that they've just experienced. So you teach 20.
Oh, that's great. Yeah.
And teach 20, and out of those 20, 3 or 4 have the guts to do it again. And they teach another 20, and so on. And it keeps spreading. And
That's amazing. Yeah.
and one of the wonderful visionary design scientist, Buckminster Fuller, he said, if you want to change the way people think, don't tell them what to think, give them a tool, the use of which will change how they think. And that was my idea with these cards that you mentioned. They're basically a set of 61 flashcards. 51 of them are directly aimed at one particular SDG. So 3 times 17, there's 3 cards for each one of the 17 SDGs. But then they already cognitively prime people to think of each SDG in a very different way, because the questions on them make you enter to that. Like, let's say the SDG is no hunger. You're asked to look at it from an economic, an ecological, a social, and a worldview perspective. And so you get a much rounder perspective on it. And the questions that you're asked are always following the pattern of saying, well, here's the global goal number so-and-so. How is this relevant to your community in your place? What is already going on in your place that maybe supports this implementation, but wasn't called SDG 1 before?
Wonderful.
And what is it that you could imagine that could happen in your community by bringing 2 or 3 existing players together that would help implement this SDG? And then it also keeps, in other parts of the program, you're invited to weave the different SDGs together and look. So to look at each individually from 4 different perspectives, but then to also always ask, can I create a project that integrates 6 or 7 SDGs and implements them all at once, rather than to create just a water project and just an energy project? And yeah, these cards ended up, I wrote the first version. I was still considering it a beta version to be improved on, but UNESCO loved it so much that we ran with them, and before we knew it, they were translated in 7 languages, in Russian and Chinese, in Portuguese, Spanish, French, and then maybe because we translated them rather quickly, they had the register of the language is relatively complex. So using them in schools or using them in rural communities with lower levels of education, sometimes people found it hard to understand the questions and needed some coaching with that. So just recently, they've been we've created a simplified version for schools and kind of rural communities with lower levels of education, and they exist in German and in English so far. And they all come together with this idea of the training of multipliers, and that training has now been held, I think, in more than 30 countries on 5 continents, over 1,500 multipliers trained, and we don't even know how many of them have then gone on keep multiplying. But it's an example of, at the center of designing regenerative cultures, my book is sort of this repetitive theme of that to create or facilitate the emergence of regenerative cultures in place, we need to come together across sectors, across perspectives, and see what we can do together to heal that place and heal our communities and create conditions conducive to life. And I call this process living the questions together. And these cards are basically an SDG framed, using the SDGs as a platform to start from, conversation around how do we make this a more sustainable and more regenerative place. And last thing that I'll say about the cards is that when I was asked to write this material, I was also quite critical of aspects of the SDGs. So, for example, SDG 8 being currently named as economic growth and good work. For me, without specifying kind of economic growth, that's actually the spanner in the works, because it continues the economic growth paradigm, which is the structurally dysfunctionality in our global system that makes us exploit each other and the planet. Yeah. And so for me, it needs to be called qualitative growth rather than growth to still have a place. But all these kind of critiques, also the critique on the development agenda that you suffered in Colombia for many years, that at some point the UN decided to divide the world into developed nations and underdeveloped nations, and then created a sort of power play of we'll give you some money and help you with your development, your developing nations, which is an insult to indigenous cultures that have wisely lived on our planet way before Europe came out of the Dark Ages. So all of that is kind of written into the cards. So they're not.
So let's just rewind a little bit, because you were breaking up and you were closing your thoughts on the cards, and you were saying that they were infused with all these critiques.
There's a critique.
Yeah.
Basically, because I've noticed that my work is very between sectors, and sometimes I talk to public authorities, sometimes to activists, sometimes to educators and to entrepreneurs, or even every now and then to corporate sector people. I really try to weave collaboration and mutual respect and mutual willingness to engage and collaborate between these sectors. And one thing that I noticed was that a lot of activist friends weren't really engaging with the SDGs when they were launched, because they saw them as a sort of top-down UN kind of process. And many were somewhat disappointed with the Agenda 21 and how that in the end had sort of fizzled out. And so a lot of the critique that the grassroots movements and the anti-globalization or the anti-neoliberal economic globalization movement had, I think, is valid. And so I wrote those into the questions on the cards and into the information, because each card has questions, but also a little bit of information coming from these four angles: ecological, social, economic, and worldview. And what was really exciting for me was that when UNESCO looked at these cards and said that they were going to do an editorial process, that none of this critical voice was edited out. And so I think that they address a lot of those issues, but give people an opportunity to have a conversation about it across sectors. And that's another, I think, powerful point of the cards. And
That's wonderful.
And then there's also the SDG project implementation canvas, which I've used a lot in workshops that I've developed since, which is basically using the basic business model canvas, but changing the questions. So it's all about how to really tunnel deep. Once you get a small group of people in a place saying, okay, we're going to create a project that addresses these 6 SDGs at once using 3 already existing organizations, and we'll put them together and do something new with them. Running them through one of these SDG project canvases, all the questions that about where do you get your funding from, who do you engage, what's your marketing strategy, like the basic questions that are also in the business model canvas, is a really powerful tool to get people from this initial, we could be doing this, to already spend an hour having a conversation of how they would do it and who they would need to talk to and how they might fund it. And so what often happens is that after a workshop, people actually look at each other and say, wow, we've done so much today. Now I guess we better do it. Like, rather than keeping it as a sort of workshop exercise, they then stay together and actually implement the project that they've dreamt up in the workshop.
Oh, it's wonderful. Where can people go and find those flashcards and the business model canvas? If they wanted to, can they buy it, or is it open source? Can they download it? Or
the manual for how to run the workshop is downloadable for free on the Gaia Education, GaiaEducation.org website. You can order the cards in the different languages, and they're not terribly expensive. And Gaia Education is an NGO that also needs to somehow finance itself. So that, unfortunately, we haven't found like the big funder yet that says, okay, we're going to pay for 1 million sets of cards to be given to anybody who orders them from you. That would be ideal. Jeff Bezos should do that.
Yes.
The cards still cost something like 18 euros, like the same as a book. But if you consider that you can run, because there's 51, well, basically you can run workshops with up to 51 people or more with one set of cards. Once it gets beyond that, like we've run workshops with 120, 200 people, then you might have to have one or two sets of cards, but they last for a very long time. And so, yeah, so you get the cards from Gaia Education, and the business model canvas is in the guidebook, the Multipliers handbook. And hopefully soon there will also be a A1 kind of scalable version that you can just download so you can have them printed locally, because it's very powerful when you have the canvas as a really big sheet that people can kind of sit on a table and almost like World Cafe style use it to work over their project.
Wonderful. I find those tools really, really wonderful. I can't wait to take a look, because I've been thinking a lot. I think a lot about those, like what's the easiest way we can communicate this and engage people's creativity and ideas and passion.
Yeah, really. Like when you do that kind of thinking, keep remembering that sentence by Buckminster Fuller.
Absolutely, that's great.
People think, give them a tool that changes the way they think. That's, for me, that's such a powerful sentence, because it is true. Like if anything from, I mean, I'm not much for video games and all that. Like I think we spend too much time virtually already, and it's better to engage with real community and real ecosystems. But even in the gamification in the virtual space, there's so much that can be done still to teach people about how to build more regenerative and more regionalized sustainable systems, and also in children's books and in education. Like I really wish that a whole new generation of educators would step up and create material to inspire people to engage with these questions and to re-envision how they can live in their place in ways that serves themselves, their community, their family, and life as a whole.
Absolutely, that's wonderful. We'll have to talk a little more, and I'll have to show you some of the things we're working on right now, and maybe we find a way to collaborate on that. And it's related to flashcards and some other workshops and stuff. But because I've been thinking about a set of things, it's not based on SDGs, but on, what would we call them, the adaptation of those SDGs to like the practical reality of everyday life in a mega city, and the individual in that city facing all those aspects of their daily life, and invite them to think, to rethink everything and rediscover that relationship to all the aspects of living in a mega city, right? Anyway, Daniel, what are you working on these days that's exciting and engaging, or what questions are you asking yourself?
Well, I personally, I'm living a little bit of a, well, there's paradoxes and there's dilemmas, and the dilemmas have this nature that you can't actually resolve them. You can only navigate them, and for me, there's a real dilemma between a very strong calling to radically localize and regionalize my own locus of focus, so to speak. Like I live on the island of Mallorca. I moved here 8 years ago with a strong vision that I wanted to grow roots in a place and commit over the long term, over 20, 25, 30, 40 years, to do my little bit to help change an entire region in a more life-sustaining direction. And I did a lot of work over the last 8 years on the island in terms of education and working with the university and working with business clusters. But sorry, there's a helicopter. But
Mallorca seems to be pretty busy, huh?
Pretty busy, yeah. I live in Palma near the airport, so it's a busy place.
Yeah.
But so because I now have a little daughter, I really want to focus on building climate resilience and prepare Mallorca as a bioregion for the next 2, 3, 4 decades, which are going to be tough on planet Earth. Like we are now facing a fundamental transformation of the human presence on Earth. And it's like a rite of passage, because we don't know whether we're going to make it. We've left it too long to have a guarantee that we can still stop climate cataclysm and irreversible runaway climate change. We're only, hopefully, we're away, still a few years away from triggering the trigger points that would mean irreversible climate change, but we don't know. We might have already done so, because what's happening with the permafrost melting and the oceans becoming carbon sources rather than carbon sinks is rather alarming.
Yeah.
Because of that, I'm sort of more and more realizing that the pathway to building, like getting through the eye of the needle and making it 3 decades from now, looking back and saying, we've done it. Everybody at each place and each region took responsibility for doing their bit in their ecosystem. And together as one species, we've somehow managed to heal the planet in time that we actually had a chance to continue living. Because Gaia is going to continue without us. Quite happily, it'll take a few million years to bounce back from the havoc we've wreaked. But if we want to have a chance that we as a species mature, and the potential that is in us as conscious reflections of a living universe experiencing itself to come to the full bloom of its cultural expression, which would be wonderful, we need to really put all hands on deck and do something about it. And so for me, doing that is focusing on place and region. But then, of course, we need to do that everywhere. And I seem to be in that dilemma that I also want to continue weaving partnerships at the global level to build the necessary infrastructure of collaboration, so we can do this globally and locally at the same time.
Yeah.
But I don't want to travel. I feel completely out of integrity. Like this autumn, for example, I'm flying to a number of events, and it just doesn't feel right anymore to be one of that 3% of humanity that jumps on planes every year.
Yeah,
and
I hear you. Yeah.
In the process blows out a huge amount, like 5% of human-made CO2 emissions are from air travel. And well, not the emissions, but the global warming effect. Emissions is about 2%, but because we emit so high up in the atmosphere with airplanes, the effect is about 5% of the total effect. And so, what am I doing to answer your question? I'm actually trying to prepare that in 2020 I will travel very much less to not at all, do a lot more work online if it's international work, and really engage more of a local conversation and my local collaborators here into Mallorca as a case study for bioregional development, and really telling the story that there is already a story here that started decades, at least 15 years ago, of people wanting to re-envision Mallorca. There was an event in 2006 that a friend of mine organized that was called Mallorca Despierta and Mallorca en Transición. So picking on transition towns, and I think a lot of groundwork has been done, and there's the current political system is in favor of experimenting with transformational change and preparing the island for increasing climate resilience and the changes that come, because locally we're dependent on tourism, and tourism is a heavily polluting industry. So I've recently engaged a lot more with like doing the good old permaculture thing of, in the problem there is the solution. If I take that lesson seriously and ask myself, is there anything in the mechanism of tourism that I can turn from being a problem into being a solution? And the more I've looked at it, the more I realize that tourism in most places touches all aspects of life. It touches energy, transport, food, all kind of materials that are used, and so local suppliers. The local education system even is touched by it. Information and education exchange, all sorts of things. And so by being an industry that reaches quite so transversely across sectors, and in some regions has a significant impact on the regional economy, tourism could be re-envisioned as a re-regionalization catalytic engine and help regions to build climate resilience. And if I can explore how that is possible and create an example of it in collaboration with the Mallorcan tourism industry here on the island, where since 85% of the economy is dependent on tourism, the only way I can build any resiliency on the island is to engage tourism. There's no other way around it. And so I'm kind of, my big new plan for next year is to somehow grab that bull by the horn and have a conversation of how tourism could be a force for regional regeneration and climate resilience building.
That's wonderful. Thanks for sharing all the insights of the last 5 minutes, because you really touched on the urgency that is required of all of us, right? Our responsibility to do something about this. And what you're saying about tourism is also a point that I and many of us are trying to get across, and it's that it's not tourism itself that is harmful. It's the way we're managing it, right? Like you were saying, there's transportation and there's food and all that. And so how are we producing all of those systems? How are we managing that system that is tourism? This in the same way that how are we managing food production and how are we managing energy production and so on and so forth.
And I mean, there's always, I mean, you can very quickly get criticized for engaging a massively polluting and negative impact industry like tourism. But realistically speaking, we now need to engage everyone, and we need to do a rapid transition at a scale, locally, regionally, and globally, that is unprecedented in the history of humanity. And I see poor connection. Can you still hear me?
Yeah.
So that fundamental transition really requires us to reach out to unusual suspects. And for example, we need to, I think, very soon regulators will start to internalize the be like the costs of, for example, the current aviation industry. Very soon it will not be possible anymore to have all these hidden subsidies that currently support the fossil fuel guzzling system. I mean, we still put 80% of energy subsidies still go towards fossil fuels and only 20 towards renewables on a global scale. Yeah. That doesn't only need to be reversed. We need to stop subsidizing fossil fuels altogether and penalizing it and making them pay for the damage done. And so that will liberate a lot of resources, but at the same time, it will also mean that hopefully a lot less people will fly. But that, of course, in the transition period, the next 5 years are critical in that. As these systems are being put in place, the tourism industry could actually use this transition period as a way of risk managing their assets and their future, because they could begin to invest in local renewable energy companies, in local food companies. They could build the necessary infrastructure of local and bioregional resilience against different issues around climate change. So basically capacity of people in place or in region to feed themselves, to have water, to have renewable energy access, to have some basic renewable energy powered transport system. All those kind of things. Tourism could actually help to be part of the mechanism of financing those local initiatives. And if they do it wisely, they just invest in local community co-ops that they're members of, and through that actually sort of devolve their global tourism empires into regional shareholders in the region. That helps people in place, helps the destinations that they've got rich with to build the infrastructure that they now need, somehow redeeming themselves for their past sins. That's I mean, it's going to be it's going to be a tough one to sell to CEOs of large tourism companies, but I'm prepared to have the conversation.
That's great. Yeah. That's a big undertaking, but this is a time for big undertakings, right?
Yeah, absolutely. It's all hands on deck time now. We don't have any more time to waste. And as I said, like the fascinating thing is that, and it's a tricky thing, that we will now have to start a global ecosystems restoration and social economic regeneration process that we will have to sustain over 10, 20, 30 years. And for the first 10 years, even if we make it massive as an effort, things will get worse. Climate change will worsen. We'll have more hurricanes, we'll have more storms, we'll have more droughts, we'll have famines. And for people not to lose heart and to understand that there's a lag in the global system that has for decades buffered our abusive behavior and is only now starting to kind of unravel and break down. In this process, we have to actually mature as a species of basically to keep on doing what we're doing of healing the planet, even if we can't be certain that it will be successful. And in that very process, I think we will find a new type of maturity as a species of also valuing life and beauty and everything that still is healthy and well around us much more for the moment we engage with it, for the experience of now engaging with a beautiful world, rather than expecting that this world has to last forever. And only if it lasts for millions of years is it valuable. We're a bit too quantity focused there. It's about the quality of how we repattern the future through how we are with each other and with nature now that has the highest chance of repatterning a regenerative world. Like it's coming back to the beginning of our conversation. That's where ultimately we've left it so long that we need to work miracles. We need to go beyond the reductionist linear trend predictions, because if we follow just the likelihood of science, then we've probably had it. So we literally need to keep open to the possibility that if we see the world differently and our relation to each other and to life as a whole differently, then that very seeing will bring forth a different world and will be part of the healing, not just kind of drawing down carbon and building soil and all those important things that we also have to do.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Daniel, for sharing all these wonderful insights and inspirational words, truly.
Thanks for triggering me, for letting me ramble.
My pleasure. I find myself in the same dilemma, right? I want to kind of travel less, connect more through the internet, but be more connected to nature and a more permanent home base outside of the city with wonderful clean air. And maybe come to the city for work every now and then or something like that.
Yeah. Soon the cities will be cleaner. I'm also looking at moving to a piece of land a little bit further out from the city, but really sometimes I walk through cities and I think how wonderful these places would be if there was no pollution, hardly any sounds, like there wouldn't be any internal combustion engines anymore. Most of the transport is electric or monorails that are up high in between the buildings, or cable cars. And you end up envisioning a whole different city where the spaces between the buildings are
wonderful
green spaces with trees. Where the Austrian architect Hundertwasser said that every place in the city, this is an alpine sentence, any place in the city where snow can settle should be green.
Yeah.
So any surface that is vertical enough, horizontal enough that snow can settle should be a green wall or a forest.
Yeah.
those are the cities I would love to live in.
Oh, that would be so wonderful. It's this, yeah, silent electric cars. You could feel the space between things, right?
And the smell of aromatic herbs, like people having kind of basilicum and cilantro and all these wonderful herbs growing on their balconies and I just the
dream
market
place,
cilantro and everything. Yeah, wonderful. Right.
All right, Daniel.
Thank you so much for this conversation, and let me know when you've got it edited so I can help to promote it on social media. I've got a few channels to push it out on.
For sure. Would you like to share with the audience some of the places they can find your work online?
But yeah, I mean the finding my looking for Daniel Christian Wahl on medium.com. There's a blog that now has 19,000 followers or something that basically has most of my writing, including most of my book in excerpts on it. And that's a way to read more and share it with other people. And then I promote a lot of those articles through Facebook. There's a Facebook page called Regenerative Cultures, and another one which is more kind of general and more sort of slightly softer in terms of just pictures and sentences and quotes, called Ecological Consciousness. And then as a sort of forum for conversation and engagement around what would regenerative consciousness look like and how do we become part of the Regeneration Rising, we've started a Facebook group called Regenerative Consciousness Community. And then on Twitter, I'm Dr. DC Wahl. It's the only place where I hang out my PhD. And and then LinkedIn as well. So lots of different places.
Wonderful.
I think if you Google my full name, you have more links than you care to follow.
All right, Daniel. Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to more conversations.
Yeah, likewise. And who knows? I just said that I don't want to travel that much anymore, but I have a real love for Latin America, and so I think one more longer adventure in Latin America that includes Colombia is definitely, hopefully, on the cards if that's a possibility.
Well, let's make it happen soon.
Maybe
yes.
Okay. Have a wonderful day.
You too, Daniel. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.